Hello there everyone! Welcome back to Void Dwarf Studios, and we dip our toe back into the world of 40k, and we are going into Space Marines. This is going to be a two-parter because I've just I've just realised just how many tanks the Space Marines alone have, and how many variants there are on it. So, this is going to be two parts. We're going to cover most tanks in part 1, but the big tanks, the super heavies, those will be in part 2, which will come out shortly. Right, so, in terms of organisation, much like the Dreadnoughts, the tanks are being kept in the armoury, so where the chapter's homeworld is, or where the Fortress Monastery is, or on wherever the Crusading Fleet will be. That is where the armoury will be also. And these vehicles will be maintained by the tech priests and their various servitors and serfs and other aides and hands. Occasionally the Mechanicum might have a tech priest dominus who turns up and is asked questions, but most of the time the tech priests that have been trained and are part of the chapter will be more than capable of looking after the machines and their spirits. So, let's start at the light end of the spectrum. And what better place to start than the humble Rhino? The Rhino chassis has been used for multiple different purposes and for different battlefield roles, primarily because it is a bit of a workhorse. This thing is rugged, tough, relatively straightforward to repair, and relatively cheap to make, well, for the Imperium anyway. And it's a perfect size to carry 10 Astartes into battle. You're not fitting Primaris in this thing, but yeah, it's been there since the beginning of the Horus Heresy. It's a fantastic little transport. Not really much in the heavy armour, it's a light tank at best, but in the Horus Heresy you could equip it with slightly heavier guns, as well as things like multi-melters. You could give them heavy bolters, They had lots of options, although in 40k your only option is a twin-link bolt gun. So it's not going to be cracking any armour, but that's not what it's for. This is a coffin. No, not a coffin. It's often a coffin because people are mean like that and they realise I don't want 10 Astartes shoved in my face. I'd rather shoot the tank and kill the Astartes inside. So little box coffin they sometimes could be, but they are quick, relatively sturdy transports, and you do need relatively heavy guns to make a real dent. We're talking heavy bolters and up, So small arms fire, in the lore at least, is unlikely to cause too much harm to these things. You then have its slightly better armed cousin, the Razorback. This thing was more prevalent in the 41st millennium than in Horus Heresy, purely because the Rhino back then just had more options for guns, and you didn't have to compensate that for transport capacity. But in 40k, the Razorback is a slightly more heavily armed variant, because you can equip this wonderful thing with twin-linked assault cannons, multi-melters, plasma cannons, las cannons, and heavy bolters. So it's a much more stable firing platform, and it's great for transporting up to 5 Marines. I personally enjoyed using this thing with my Black Templars, which is why I still have one in my force. Basically, what I would do is I'd have my Crusader squads with their chaplains rushing up in the Land Raiders, and then followed up quickly behind would be a Razorback containing Grimaldus, probably Helbrecht, and then when the Crusaders pop out of their wonderful crusading Land Raiders, charge into the enemy, Grimaldus will be behind, giving them the various buffs from the relics, and Helbrecht giving them buffs on the charge. So yeah, that was a fun way of playing the game. It became so effective at one point that I had to stop playing Templars, and simply because I just kept winning the same way over and over again and realised that's no fun. But that was a while ago now. Anyway, Razorback is much more capable of dealing with heavy armoured foes, simply because of you can stick heavier guns on it. I would not call this a mainline tank still though, because its armour is still relatively light, and it is really there for transporting troops. Just more high priority troops. And now the Primaris can get their own fun into the transporting gig, because they now have the Impulsor, essentially their equivalent of a Rhino, except this one hovers, and it looks like it's got a bit more heavy weaponry attached. Yeah, the Imperium was upping its game in terms of heavy firepower, particularly for the Primaris. But it's a essentially it's a Rhino that hovers, so it's far more maneuverable, and it's got a bit thicker armor. So, that's cool. The repulsor we've seen for a little while now. This thing is kind of the Land Raider equivalent, except it's got so many more guns. It's actually kind of insane how many guns are sticking out of this thing. The many, many, many guns you can choose to arm this thing with include a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon as a main cannon, a twin-linked bolter, an iron hail heavy stubber, an Icarus iron hail heavy stubber, 2 crack storm grenade launchers, 2 storm bolters, and auto lancers. And if you want to, you can replace the heavy bolters with twin las cannons. The heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, basically a souped up assault cannon, can be replaced with what is called a las talon, basically a meaner las cannon. The iron hail heavy stubbers can be replaced with onslaught Gatling cannons, and you can have, instead of storm bolters, frag storm grenade launchers. Or you can have an Icarus rocket pod instead of the iron hail heavy stubber. This thing has so many guns, it's actually kind of absurd that they can all fire as effectively as they can, but I'm going to put this up to sophisticated onboard targeting systems and, well, capable pilots, because, it is Primaris after all. This thing is absurd in the number of bullets it can shove out, and the fact that it can transport 10 people, 10 Primaris, is, yeah. This thing is a bit redonkulous, to say the least. And it is definitely a mainline battle tank. This thing can go toe-to-toe with predators without any problems whatsoever. Although, make sure you make use of its transport capacity. Whilst it doesn't assault as well as, say, a Land Raider, it's still going to take 10 Primaris Marines, so stick a couple aggressors inside there with, their heavy flamers, drop them out, and then scorch earth policy begins. Yeah, this tank is kind of ridiculous, but incredible at what it does. Now we come to a tank that is actually one of my favourites. I've used them both for my Iron Hands in Horus Heresy, and you'll see pictures of some of my Iron Hands in, well, whenever appropriate. And I used them a lot in 40k because I actually found these were more useful than, say, buying an Imperial Knight. The Vindicator. This is your siege tank. If you're a Space Marine and you want to crack down some walls, or you think there's a particularly unpleasant looking knight coming your way, get 3 of these into a nice little squad and boom. The Horus Heresy ones had far more sophisticated and insane weapons. I just want to call it there, say insane weapons. The modern Vindicator has what is called a demolisher cannon. Essentially, it is there for destroying fortifications, tank formations, and yeah, this thing is a fantastic killer. I've had a group of 3 of these in a game of equal points with an Imperial Knight, and the 3 of these Vindicators just demolished the Knight in about 2 turns. Yeah, I like Vindicators. They're not as powerful as they used to be because of how Blast works. But who knows, maybe with 9th edition round the corner, these guys will become far more effective, as they are claiming tanks will be more effective in this edition. Essentially, this is where we start getting tanks with a bit more heavy armour on. The Vindicator's front armour is far better than the average Rhino, and it can take a bit more of a beating because of it. And the 40k variants get these lovely siege bulldozer blades, which meant that they could ignore any terrain issues. So, if someone had, placed tank traps to try and slow down your vehicles, these things can just push them out of the way. So, they are great for going over areas of terrain you don't really want to risk, and also they are fantastic at killing everything. I'm actually trying to think of something they'd struggle to kill, because mobs, you can just blast to smithereens. I think you have to start getting to knights and titans for these things to start struggling. I mean, they'll be useless at shooting down airplanes, that's a given. They'll be useless at flyers, but if it's on the ground and it's walking, yeah, Vindicators are a very solid choice. The Demolisher Cannon is short range, so you're gonna have to get close. I suppose that is the main drawback for these poor little things. You've got to get close for that cannon to be effective, but so long as they're properly supported, yeah, these things are going to wreck lots and lots and lots of vehicles. Now, if I've said the Vindicator is one of the best mainline battle tanks the 40k Imperium has, well, at least for the Astartes, I should say, then the close tiebreaker for that particular title should go to the Predator. Again, this thing has been around since the Horus Heresy along with the Vindicator, and it has served the Imperium well. Still based on the Rhino chassis, but with heavier front armour and some side sponsons, this thing is great at killing other tanks, and has the versatility to basically be used for multiple battlefield roles. And particularly in the Horus Heresy, there were quite a few variations of this thing, ranging from just horde killers where you just stick heavy flamers on this thing and watch things vanish, to tank killers where you can stick las cannons on everything. It was so much fun having these in 40k, or you can equip them with things like heavy bolters and a heavy autocannon, which means that they're pretty good all-rounders. And it's this versatility that makes the Predator such a fantastic tank. It's not going to be as powerful as the Vindicator with the Demolisher cannon, but it makes up for that by having far longer range, and the las cannon is nothing to sniff at. This thing is pretty capable of destroying anything except the heaviest of tanks. Although I would try and avoid sending these things to fight infantry unless you have some of the special variants, such as the Blood Angel's Bowel Predator, where instead of the typical las cannon or autocannon, it's equipped with a twin-linked assault cannon, and they tend to have either flamethrowers or heavy bolters on the side. Yeah, these things are great for killing hordes of infantry, or lightly armoured tanks. So yeah, if you're going to have Predators in your army, I would suggest taking them into squads of 3. Same with, I think, every tank I'm going to talk about here until we get to the super heavies, in which case they don't tend to come in squads. But anyway, take them in groups of 3, target one thing at a time with all of them, make sure it's dead, and move on to the next. Which ironically is standard Imperium battle doctrine. Point this thing at the heaviest target, destroy it, and move on. And I think this kind of simplistic mentality that makes me like the Imperium. It's a very simple tactic, but actually it has a lot of merit, and fantastically translates to the tabletop as well. We are now momentarily going to move away from the main frontline battle tank, and move into something that should really stay at the back, as much as possible anyway, because now we're talking about anti-air defense. First up, we have the Stalker variant. This is based on the whirlwind pattern artillery tank, which we will be getting to later on, where essentially instead of having multiple missile pods as the whirlwind has, you have the storm cannon. These really interesting guns are each controlled by a single servitor mind. What this means is that this tank is more capable of tracking multiple targets than, well, other vehicles, because it has that additional capacity to, well, predict and operate independently from the pilot. In addition to this, these two guns can fire as I've said, these two guns can fire independently of different targets, or they can both combine to form a single targeting mode and, well, blast the unfortunate thing out of the sky. This is definitely a tank you want to keep at the back, because whilst it's amazing at shooting things out of the sky, it's not going to do very well against ground targets. And you see those wonderful posts that are pushed into the ground on its sides? Yeah, it's not going to get away quickly either. You really want to make sure this thing is nowhere near the front lines. I can't emphasize this enough. But if you feel that you're acquiring more anti-air firepower, then you want to move away from the Stalker, or you will take a squad of 3 Stalkers and upgrade one to be a Hunter. Now, a Hunter is... well, let me just give you a brief description of the ammunition used for this thing. Each missile that comes out of the Sky Spear launcher, it is a pre-blessed warhead that contains the relics of a distinguished chapter servant. So each one of these missiles is kind of considered a relic and is holy in its own right. So that's how we're starting this. But to make things more fun, the servitor's mummified brain, this is the targeting computer, means that it can second guess what the target's going to do and change the missile's trajectory because of it. Yes, we have a homing missile that's being aimed by a mummified brain, and the missile is blessed with the relics of a dead saint. Or serf, I should say. Yeah, so this thing's very hard to avoid. If you're an air target, you really don't want this thing shooting at you because it'll keep tracking you and it will keep following you. And yeah, how this worked in the rules, essentially you had what was known as a jink save. Essentially it was a roll you got to make regardless of any other saves that might have been removed, unless the thing had, like ignore jink or something. Basically, this thing forces you to re-roll your jink save. Which, yeah, that was pretty horrible at the time. I've not actually used these variants of tanks by myself, mostly because the people I've fought haven't tended to bring much in the way of air superiority. Unless it's like a Storm Raven or maybe a Storm Talon or something like that. And yeah, they didn't tend to be too much of a problem because I had my Predators. I would just shoot them out of the sky with that. Although these things are definitely the best way to auto-remove anything that's flying. And again, if you keep these tanks at the back of your lines, they're going to just cause all kinds of mayhem and make sure that the skies are nice and clear. Our last tank, based on the Rhino chassis, ignoring the repulsor, is the Whirlwind. This is another artillery tank, and yes, it should be kept at the back of your lines. But it is definitely something you may want to consider having in your army. This thing can just output a huge quantity of missiles. And I used to use a couple of these because they were great at killing hordes. The Whirlwind Multiple Missile Launcher gave you two options. Essentially, they were massive frag or crack missiles. Frag essentially being the, in case you're unaware of what these mean, frag being the equivalent of anti-infantry and crack being your anti-tank rounds. They are not as powerful as a las cannon, but they are not as weak as, say, a heavy bolter. They are a nice sort of middle between the two. And it also has additional ammunition that you can equip them with, depending on what time frame we're talking about and what Space Marine faction. For example, the Death Watch have a number of different types, including Vengeance missiles, basically high explosive warheads, just a better crack missile essentially, a Castellan missile, which more or less is a small meteor shower of mines, so they tend to scatter them all over the area they've shot at, and you tread on the mine and you go boom. Or you have the Incendiary Castellan missile, which works in a similar way, except that it explodes and burning hot promethium just lands on top of you. Basically napalm. Ugh, yeah. But every Space Marine faction with a Whirlwind does get access to anti-air missiles, similar to the Hunter pattern Whirlwind, but, not as big as that absurd monstrosity is, and frag and crack, which are pretty good for dealing with most things. This is a lighter artillery tank, I want to say, but it is definitely one that you should consider, because it's just versatile, and that's part of the thing that makes it so great. And this is the last vehicle that we have a look at, which has the Rhino chassis. We're now going to leave it behind, and we're going to step back further into the Warhammer 40k world, to the Horus Heresy, where now we look at the Sakaran, and the various other patterns that it has. I fondly have Sakaran tank, and I love these things. I want to say they are sort of the Horus Heresy equivalent of the mainline battle tank, but they are so much faster. You won't see these in 40k unless they are used as a relic of some kind of the chapters, because they're just that rare, and the guns you can fit on them are typically things that are las cannons and better. For example, the main gun for a Sakaran is the Accelerator Autocannon. Basically, it's a rapid-firing autocannon. It is a beautiful piece of engineering, and I just love these things. They're just so much... I almost want to use the word sexier, It's just got so much more pleasing shapes and lines to the blocky Rhino chassis. But there we go. The Horus Heresy was a time of innovation and, a bit more artistry, I might say, for the Space Marines. And it helped that their armories were, legion size, so they just had far more time and technical expertise in order to maintain and, well, look after these things. But yeah, your Sakaran is very much like your Predator in the 40k because you can mount it with lots of different types of guns, ranging from the absurd, such as the Omega Sakaran tank destroyer, basically with a gigantic set of twin-linked plasma cannons, or you can take one that is equipped with a neutron laser. And yeah, there's another variant which is purely for anti-infantry, known as the Punisher. Basically, it has a rotating Punisher cannon, and one of my personal favourites, and a tank I actually own, the Arca Strike Tank. Basically, this is your whirlwind on steroids. The Arcus launcher is a thing of beauty, and it just does far more damage, and it's a very versatile tank. Sakarans are strange in that they really were the Imperium's answer to a fast tank destroyer. These are much, much, much faster than your Predators or your Rhinos. They just had they just had better tech marines back then in those days, I guess. And the very few that are around now are almost always kept in a stasis field, and, well, it's arguable to say that the tech marines don't entirely understand these vehicles anymore. When they try to commune with the machine spirit within, they tend to find that this machine spirit is, should we say, a bit wrathful, I think might be the word I would use. A bit eager, perhaps. And they find this a little unnerving sometimes, as they are used to calming machine spirits and, trying to get them to be more cooperative, whereas these things tend to be violent. Many of these tanks were used either within the Eye of Terror, or encountered on demon worlds, or recovered from demon worlds, and, well, this tended to mean that the tank's spirit tended to pick up a more hateful influence, shall we say. Yeah, you need to be careful if you unlock one of these and decide to use it on the battlefield, because they're not very well understood by the 40k. Although, as you've got Mr. Girlyman back and Belisarius Crawl's tinkering, perhaps they'll be able to understand the Sakaran battle tank once again and help its spirit calm itself and be more useful to the Imperium. But for now, these things are pretty much exclusively used in the Horus Heresy, and they are fantastic tanks. You can have them in all different shapes and sizes, you can use them for all different purposes, and they're fast. This is the main thing that I love about these tanks. They are fast and with big heavy guns. What more can you ask for? I hope you've enjoyed this episode into 40k. I'm gonna take part 2 for next week, where we will be looking at the heavy tanks. The real meat of the armoury, as it were. This will include Land Raiders, the Megalodon transport from the Horus Heresy, and the other various absurd heavy tanks like Sakarans. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please like and subscribe and spread the word. And I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Take care, everyone.